Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies Initiative. I'd like to say a few words about what we do in contemplative studies. What we do is we study human contemplative practices across cultures and across time from humanistic, scientific, and artistic points of view. We also have developed a unique integrative contemplative pedagogy by which we actually teach students how to try out different contemplative practices in the classroom that are directly related to the reading. We have a kind of combination of third and second and critical first-person engagement with the material so that it's possible to teach contemplative practices in the classroom without requiring that students believe in the truth of the cognitive framework in which the contemplative practices are embedded. Students learn what the cognitive frameworks are, but they don't have to believe in the truth of the cognitive frameworks, which is something that would happen if you're doing first-person practice in a committed religious tradition, for example. We have a new concentration. This is an undergraduate program with a science track, a humanities track, and a series of core courses. You can see a few of our concentrators are here. We now have, or we will have within the next week, 14 concentrators. And we really just got started, so it's a pretty impressive number. And if you'd like to learn more about our concentration program, there is a summary of the concentration program here. Please pick it up on your way out. I also want to mention to you that we have a contemplative studies summer intensive. It's 3 courses that we teach in the summer school. They all have meditation labs associated with them, what we call meditation labs. In those meditation labs, we don't hook you up or hook you up onto any fMRIs or EEGs, but they're labs in the sense of trying out contemplative practices in the laboratory of your own body-mind. So we have 3 courses. One of them is Introduction to Contemplative Studies, which some of you are taking, I see here. We also are teaching meditation in the brain, and we're also teaching, of course, a brand new course called Science, Religion, and the Search for Happiness in Traditional Asian Thought. That's a new course this summer for us. So if you'd like to learn more about the courses, and I urge you, if you're going to be here this summer, this is a worthwhile way to spend your summers. The nice thing about our contemplative studies summer classes is that they're small. We limit them to 20, and they usually don't get that high. So if you want a smaller, more intimate classroom setting, or if you need one more course to graduate, I don't know that that's a fact, any of you seniors, but then I strongly recommend any of our courses this summer. Also, we have a series of events that we organize every semester. If you haven't yet registered for the workshop that Professor Kamyati is leading on Sunday from 11 to 5 in Winnick Chapel, there are still a few spaces left for last-minute registrations. Also, Professor Kamyati will be lecturing and giving the 11th Mary Interlandi Memorial Lecture Monday at 5:30 in List 120, and it will be on the topic of critical subjectivity. Critical subjectivity really relates very much to the concept of critical first-person engagement that we are developing here in contemplative studies. So how can you be a scholar of religious traditions and embrace both the insider and the outsider perspective? Some people say it can't be done. We say it can be done well. It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Louis Kamyati at the University of San Diego. Louis is, without a doubt, one of the outstanding young scholars in the field of Daoist studies. Really outstanding scholars of any age. He has published at least 5 books, and then there's 10 handbooks and about 30 articles. He's been an incredibly prolific scholar. But one of the unique things about Louis's approach is that it is not only well informed by a deep knowledge of the Chinese tradition and Chinese history and language and of the Daoist tradition, but he's also well trained and well informed by religious studies sensibilities and the cross-cultural study of religious and mystical experience. And the third part is that he is himself a practicing Daoist priest, an ordained Daoist priest. And so he brings the perspective of a practitioner and a scholar, which is still, unfortunately, all too rare, both in the sciences and the humanities. It's a wonderful opportunity that we have for Lewis's visit, which is co-sponsored by the Contemplative Studies Initiative and the Office of the Chaplains and Religious Life, which manages the Intervention Fund. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm round welcome to Professor Lewis Covington.
Well, hello and welcome. Can you hear me? I tend to have a strong voice, so I don't really want to stand over there in the corner with the microphone. So is this okay? All right. So if you haven't done so already, please silence or turn off your cell phones. I'd also respectfully request that anyone who wishes to use electronic devices, especially laptops, sit in the back or the side of the room. I want to thank the Contemplative Studies Initiative and the Department of Religious Studies for sponsoring this lecture, as well as my friend, colleague, and mentor, Harold Roth, for the opportunity to visit Brown. I have a clear memory of a direct experience with a wild horse, quote unquote. Shortly after we found our last dog, Katahdin, a vital, strong-willed, mischievous, and ultimately sweet Siberian Husky rescue, my wife and I found ourselves on Vashon Island, Washington, near a pasture with a solitary horse. Unexpectedly, our new dog jumped out of the car and began chasing the horse back and forth through the pasture. Fearing for the safety of both animals, but especially for the horse, I began chasing our dog, chasing the horse through knee-deep Pacific Northwest mud. After about 20 minutes, I managed to tackle Katahdin. Needless to say, the two of us had a serious, albeit wet and muddy, conversation about appropriate canine behavior. This was an experience of a wild or out-of-control dog more than that of a horse, but it reveals the complexity of human-animal relationships and the way in which various experiences might influence symbolic animalistic conceptions of human experience. It also, perhaps, provides a glimpse into the potential dangers of undisciplined behavior. Here, my presentation focuses on the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures, a late medieval set of illustrated poems, with particular attention to contemplative practice and contemplative experience. However, I also want to bring attention to other dimensions of contemplative practice, including aesthetics, art, material culture, human-animal relationships, and psychology. As the name suggests, the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures are about taming the wild horse, quote unquote, not taming the wild dog, quote unquote. Here, a word is in order about wildness. The relationship between wildness and cultivation or domestication in Taoist context is a complex topic. For example, members of the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism established the foundational Taoist view that human beings are innately connected to the Tao. This includes a positive view of nature and wildness, with the associated human state of cosmological attunement. Taoist concern for and interest in naturalness or suchness, ziran, which literally means self-so or being so of itself, as isness by extension, often involve both close observation of nature and the invocation of animals, including as models for human behavior. In the context of classical Taoism, animals are usually placed in the category of the 10,000 beings, quote unquote, Yuan Wu, with the character Wu including the neo-ox radical. However, classical Taoists also took interest in particular animals, including fish, frogs, horses, mice, quail, turtles, and so forth. This attentiveness to small beings, including insects, stands in contrast to more common cross-cultural tendencies in which so-called charismatic megafauna, such a great term, charismatic megafauna, large, powerful animals, are usually privileged, although classical Taoist texts also mention horses, oxen, wolves, and so forth. For present purposes, it is noteworthy that Chapter 9 of the Zhuangzi, the Book of Master Zhuang, associated with the primitivist lineage, is titled Horse Hooves and contains an explicit critique of Bo Le, a retainer of Duke Mu, who ruled from 659 to 621 BCE of the state of Qin. Bo Le was a famous horse trainer, an important skill for those in ancient China with political and military responsibilities and ambitions, and the legendary inventor of equine physiognomy, that is, judging a horse's qualities based on physical appearance. That is, there is an alternative Taoist way of the horse, Ma Dao, in the Zhuangzi, which emphasizes letting be. Moreover, we find a parallel view in the famous chapter 17 of the same text, which is associated with the Zhuangist lineage. So I've put in bold the animal terms, which oftentimes are overlooked when people read the Zhuangzi. So one who understands the Tao is certain to understand the essential principles. One who understands essential principles is certain to know how to deal with circumstances. And one who knows how to deal with circumstances will not allow things to harm oneself. When a person has perfect virtue, fire cannot burn him, water cannot drown him, cold and heat cannot afflict him, birds and wild animals cannot injure him. I do not say that he makes light of these things. I mean that he distinguishes between safety and danger, contents himself with fortune or misfortune, and is cautious in his comings and goings. Therefore, nothing can harm him. Hence, it is said, the celestial, Tian, is on the inside, the human, Ren, is on the outside. Inner power, De, resides in the celestial. Understand the actions of the heavens and humanity. Base yourself upon the heavens. Take your stand in inner power, and then, although you hasten or hold back, bend or stretch, you may return to the essential, Fan Yao, and speak of the ultimate, Yu Ji. Horses and oxen have 4 feet. This is what I mean by the celestial. Putting a halter on the horse's head, piercing the ox's nose, this is what I mean by the human. So I say, do not let what is human wipe out what is celestial. Do not let what is purposeful wipe out what is fated. Do not let the desire for gain lead you after fame. Be cautious, guard it, and do not lose it. This is what I mean by returning to the real, Fan Zhen. In addition to containing an explicit reference to both oxen and horses, this passage suggests that humans, when disoriented from the Tao, domesticate animals. Specifically, they subjugate animals and force them to become the means to fulfill human desires. The restriction of freedom, the domestication of wildness, is a sign of spiritual degeneration. In terms of our late medieval Taoist source on horse taming, suffice it to say that I do not believe that this particular depiction of contemplative practice is about wild horses in the true sense, that is, undomesticated horses, although I will return to the question of the animal towards the end of this presentation. Rather, the Daoist horse taming pictures are about recapturing untethered domesticated horses, specifically our own chaotic and uncontrolled psychological states. True wildness, then, represents our innate nature, Xing, our connection to the Tao, which is characterized by stillness. In any case, the Daoist horse taming pictures are a late medieval Taoist adaptation of the famous Chan, or Japanese Zen Buddhist Oxherding Pictures, which represents an important orientation point for this presentation. Interestingly, there are also a variety of illustrations utilizing other animals to represent stages on the contemplative path, including the elephant taming pictures. So I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's going up. And so you can see the black elephant becoming white and eventually becoming white. And interestingly, so I'll talk more about this with the Daoist horse taming pictures, the Tibetan monk is on the back of the elephant. So one thing to be kind of thinking about is what's the relationship between the human and the animal being depicted in these various illustrations. So little research has been done on this particular contemplative cartography, but it appears to have been first composed in the 19th century. There are also various depictions of elephant, this is where I am. Okay, sorry. So there's little research on this, but we have other representations that are focusing also on, in Sufism, on the donkey taming pictures. which are discussed briefly in Arthur Buehler's contribution to my forthcoming edited volume titled Contemplative Literature, a comparative source book on meditation and contemplative prayer. So this is why it's going in the opposite direction. Okay, thanks. So here you see it's moving in this direction, coming around, disappearing into emptiness, and then returning to the marketplace. Also noteworthy are the increasing numbers of interreligious and popular culture engagements with the Chan Buddhist Oxherding Pictures, including Christian contemplative commentaries. For example, Father William Menninger, one of the founders of the Centering Prayer Movement, is working on a Catholic contemplative commentary. John Cage, who lived from 1912 to 1992, the experimental music composer and avant-garde artist, also published a more creative engagement. A great deal of research on such modern adaptations has been conducted by Marwood Larson Harris of Roanoke College. As the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures are a Daoist adaptation of the slightly earlier Chan Buddhist Oxherding Pictures, here some background on the latter is in order. Professor Roth has informed me that a number of you have previously studied the Oxherding Pictures, so I look forward to a potential conversation following this presentation. To begin, ox translates nyo, which has also been rendered as water buffalo. We are dealing with a domesticated draft animal, a beast of burden, quote unquote. In addition, the so-called Oxherding Pictures do not contain any reference to herding. The standard title is Shernyo-tu, which may simply be rendered as Illustrations of the 10 Bulls. The extant Oxherding Pictures are actually a series of earlier poems with later illustrations, which raises questions about the identity of the composers of the poetry and the illustrations. The Oxherding Pictures have survived in a variety of editions. The two most famous and influential are those with poems written by Puming, who lived in the 11th century, and Yuan, who lived in the 12th century. Of these, as far as current research is concerned, it appears that Puming's version is the oldest extant one. However, according to Yuan's own preface and an accompanying commentary, there were two earlier or contemporaneous versions. One by Qingju, who lived in the 11th century, which consisted of 5 poems and illustrations, and the other by Zi de Huihui, who lived from 1090 to 1159, which consisted of 6 poems and illustrations. In any case, the two primary extant editions are those of Puming and Yuan, both from the Songjin period, the same period during which the slightly later Daoist Horse Taming Pictures were composed. Both of these Chan Buddhists remain obscure, although it appears that Yuan was a member of the Linji lineage, that is, the Rinzai lineage. Their texts are contained in the Shuzang Jing, the supplement to the Buddhist canon, specifically in volume 64 as text number 1270 and 1269, respectively. They also exist in various independent editions with illustrations by a variety of illustrators. Puming's version has been translated by D.T. Suzuki in his Manual of Zen Buddhism, 1934, and most recently by Red Pine or Bill Porter in 1987. Yuan's version has been translated by D.T. Suzuki in the same work, by Paul Reps and Nyogen Senzaki in Zen Flesh and Zen Bones in 1957, and by Philip Kapleau in The Three Pillars of Zen in 1965, among others. Unfortunately, we have yet to see a comprehensive historical study with attention to the various editions and other critical questions, such as earlier Buddhist precedents employing bovine-centered imagery and analogies. For example, the Yi Jiao Jing, the Sutra on the Bequeathed Teachings, a Chinese translation traditionally attributed to the famous monk translator Kumarajiva, who lived from 344 to 413, but now widely assumed to be an indigenous Chinese composition, contains the followings. Quote, Buddhists, once you're able to keep the precepts, you should prevent your 5 senses from indulging in the 5 desires. Be like the herd boy with his staff in hand, who watches over his ox and keeps it from running into the grain fields, end quote. Interestingly, this text was highly influential in Chan Buddhism and eventually collected in the Fozu Sanjing, the 3 sutras of the Buddhas and the patriarchs. In any case, an important foundation for deciphering the complex history is the French publication of Catherine Desput, 1981, which includes French translations of the Puming and Quanzhen editions, as well as the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures and the Tibetan Elephant Taming Pictures. For present purposes, the two editions of the Oxherding Pictures are noteworthy for their different depictions of the Chan Buddhist contemplative path. While both consist of 10 illustrated poems, there are differences. One significant variation involves the color of the ox. In Puming's edition, training involves gradual progress, which is represented by a progressive whitening of the ox. In Quanzhen's version, there is no whitening process. The ox remains black throughout. In addition, the sequence of events and the religious implications of the final outcome differ. In the Puming edition, the boy tames the ox, and the two exist in a paradisiacal state and then move into a mystical realm. By the penultimate picture, the ox is gone, and in the last, the boy also disappears, leaving an empty circle. In the Quanzhen version, the empty circle appears in the 8th picture, but by the end, the boy, without the ox, re-enters the ordinary world to apply his enlightenment in the marketplace. So that kind of recalls the Sufi donkey taming pictures as well. To use Professor Harold Ross' helpful distinction, which is partially indebted to Walter Stace and Arthur Dykman, we may consider Puming's version as an introvertive or unitive approach, while Quanzhen's version represents an extrovertive or applied approach. The Daoist Horse Taming Pictures are adapted from the Puming edition of the Chan Buddhist Oxherding Pictures, which maps the contemplative path as a 10-stage process. There are 10 illustrated poems, 8 of which are bovine-centered. As mentioned, this version depicts an introvertive and gradual approach to contemplative practice, implicitly taking a stand, no pun intended, on the seminal Chan Buddhist debate about the mirror and mind polishing. Puming suggests that one must engage in consistent and prolonged meditation. Specifically, one must purify consciousness by removing various defilements, represented by the black color, pictures 1 through 5. One gradually enters a purified state of consciousness, represented by the white color, pictures 6 through 8, and eventually attains enlightenment, represented by the empty circle. That is, there are 10 steps or stages. Interestingly, the final image is often interpreted as an empty circle. The earlier illustrations 3 through 5 and 7 through 9 depict the full moon. In this respect, one also notices that the moon is absent from illustration 6, the transition from the black to the white ox. Another interesting iconographic feature, one rarely commented on, but noteworthy from a Daoist perspective, and I mean, is there an influence, is the presence of the constellations in illustrations 8 and 9. Under one reading, illustration 8 depicts the 4 major stars of the western constellation of Lyra, with Vega usually appearing as a 5th star, being the brightest. In traditional Chinese astronomy, Vega is the weaving maiden. Mythologically speaking, on the 7th day of the 7th moon, when all of the magpies on Earth fly up to heaven and form a bridge across the Milky Way, the weaving maiden meets the cowherd, representing the western star of Altair in the Aquila constellation. That is, here the two beings, the ox herder, the practitioner, and the ox, consciousness, mind, or the capacity for enlightenment, finally merge together with a cosmological dimension. In illustration 9, after the ox has disappeared, the ox herder stands alone facing the northern dipper, but viewed from the other shore, quote unquote. From a traditional Taoist perspective, the northern or Big Dipper represents fate, Ming. One has transcended ordinary human fate, or karma, and realized one's true fate, or karma, namely liberation, or enlightenment. Thus, like other medieval and late imperial examples, there appears to be a Buddhist and Taoist cross-pollination, perhaps Buddho-Taoist syncretism, with the empty circle perhaps representing the end of distinct religious identity and sectarianism. As we now transition into the Daoist horse taming pictures, I would like to bring your attention to one other key feature of Puming's Oxherding Pictures, namely the empty circle, alternatively the full moon, which represents enlightenment. As you will see, the Daoist horse taming pictures utilize the human or shepherd and animal horse binary, but lack the empty circle component. This is noteworthy because other earlier and contemporaneous Daoist illustrated manuals do employ such imagery with its associated disappearance model of spiritual realization. The Daoist horse taming pictures, like other illustrated manuals of contemplative practice and contemplative experience, bring our attention to one expression of what might be labeled contemplative art. In this case, visual and material culture related to contemplative practice. In terms of Taoism, we find various maps of transformation that inform and express Taoist contemplative experience, specifically the benefits and transformative effects of intensive training. The associated diagrams have often been utilized as meditation aids. One such map of stages on the contemplative path are the Daoist horse taming pictures, which consist of 10 primary equine-centered illustrations and 3 secondary non-equine-centered illustrations. So again, it's going in this direction. Let us pause for a moment and consider these images. The Daoist horse taming pictures are contained in the first scroll or Yuan of the 2-scroll Shangshen Xiuzhen Sanyao, the 3 essentials for cultivating perfection according to the highest vehicle, hereafter Xiuzhen Sanyao, which was written by Gao Daokuan, whom I will discuss momentarily. As mentioned, the horse taming pictures are a 13th century Daoist adaptation of the famous Chan Buddhist Oxherding Pictures, specifically the 10-picture version of the obscure figure Pu Ming. The primary textual layer of the Xiuzhen Sanyao centers on 12 illustrated poems, followed by line verse commentary on each poem. As you can see from the woodblock illustrations, the Daoist horse taming pictures are a map of transformation in which Daoist contemplative practice and contemplative experience are understood as a stage-based process conceptualized in terms of taming the wild horse. I will examine the polyvalent contextual meaning of the horse shortly, but for now we may note that the 10 primary equine-centered illustrations depict an attendant, significantly not a rider, first catching an escaped domesticated horse, that is illustration 1, then training this horse, illustrations 2 through 4, and finally becoming companions of the horse, illustrations 5 through 10. The culmination of this training process involves the attendant and the horse sleeping harmoniously side by side. In all of the pictures, one notices that the horse only has a bridle with reins, not a saddle, and that, especially beginning in the 5th illustration, the reins hang freely. The horse is not and does not need to be tied up or corralled. That is, the point of training is to direct rather than fully subjugate the horse, that is thought, although perhaps disturbingly, one must sometimes use a switch or crop at the beginning of the process, poems 1 and 2 and illustration 2. Here it is noteworthy that the character bang, literally stick, translated as switch, is the same one occasionally utilized to refer to the Chan wake-up stick. Like the more common ban or board, bang contains the mu, the wood radical. This stands in contrast to the character bien, literally whip, which contains the ge, leather radical, utilized in the Oxherding pictures. So I'm taking that to be significant in terms of what's actually going on in relationship to the animal in particular. With respect to the authorship and context, Gao Daokuan, who lived from 1195 to 1277 and whose Daoist ordination name was Yuanming, complete illumination, was a 3rd generation member of the Quanzhen complete perfection Daoist monastic movement and thus a complete perfection monk in the monastic order. He was a disciple of the obscure figure Li Chongshu, early 13th century, who was in turn a disciple of Ma Yu, 1123 to 1184, and then of Qiu Chuji, 1148 to 1227, both of whom were senior 1st generation disciples of the founder. Gao also eventually trained under Yu Zhidao, 1166 to 1250, whose Taoist name was Dongzhen, Cavernous Perfection, also a disciple first of Ma and then of Qiu. So you'll see there's a lineage chart coming up that will help you kind of make sense of why this matters. Yu was appointed abbot of Chongyanggong, the palace of Chongyang, or redoubled Yang, in present-day Huxian, Shanxi, in 1238. After his death in 1250, Yu was succeeded by his disciple Li Daoqian, 1219 to 1296, the most famous early complete perfection historiographer. The Shoujun Sanyao is the only extant work of Gao. Lineage, training, and transmission are centrally important in the Taoist tradition in general, and complete perfection Taoism in particular. Specifically, Taoists tend to consider their spiritual genealogy, or lines of descent, through family metaphors, such as by referring to one's primary teacher as master father, Shifu, and one's teacher's teacher as master grandfather, Shiye. As this can be complex and confusing, I created a lineage chart for Gao Daokuan. So Wang Zhe is the founder of the tradition. So moving into two of his senior disciples and then down into where we are today in this presentation. Gao's location in early complete perfection Taoism is significant, as he trained with two teachers, Li and Yu, who were both direct disciples of Ma and Qiu. Ma Yu and Qiu Chuji were members of the so-called Seven Perfected, Qizhen, that is, senior first-generation Shandong disciples of Wang Zhe, the founder of complete perfection. There is a direct line of transmission which includes formal monastic ordination. As mentioned, Gao Daokuan was a third-generation member of the complete perfection monastic order. Here I will be content to discuss some salient characteristics of this Taoist movement, with particular attention to contemplative practice as it relates to the horse taming pictures. The complete perfection monastic order was established under Qiu Chuji and his disciples. It represents the institutionalization of the earlier complete perfection regional and national movement, which emphasized ascetic, meditative, and mystical praxis. By the early 13th century, it consisted of a vast network of temples and monasteries with nationwide distribution. Emphasis was placed on renouncing the four hindrances, sihai, of alcohol, sex, wealth, and anger. Contemporaneous monastic manuals describe daily monastic life, including social structure and conduct. Within the broader parameters of complete perfection monastic life, the primary practice centered on dedicated and prolonged meditation, including both quietistic and alchemical types. Often referred to as quiet sitting, Jingzuo, the former is an emptiness-based or stillness-based practice in which one simply empties the heart-mind of emotional and intellectual activity. It is contentless, non-conceptual, and non-dualistic. The latter is referred to as internal alchemy, Neidan. It involves stage-based contemplative practice utilizing complex methods aimed at complete psychosomatic transformation, or immortality from a Taoist perspective. Specifically, it aims to activate, or the question is it create, the Taoist subtle energetic body, and to form the embryo of immortality, quote unquote, xiantai, often referred to as the yang spirit, yangshan, or the body beyond the body, shenwai shen. This is the body composed of elixir fields, dantian, and meridians, that is, subtle locations and channels through which qi circulates. We may reconstruct the contemplative practice for which the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures provide a contemplative map, a description of contemplative experience, by consulting relevant contemporaneous texts, including the Dadan Zhizhi, direct pointers to the great elixir. This and other texts inform us that aspiring Taoist adepts must train under the guidance of an elder, and that this elder will provide methods appropriate to individual affinities and requirements. This includes both quietistic and alchemical techniques, either in isolation or in combination. Under my reading, the horse taming pictures primarily illustrate a quietistic approach, which is partially supported by the general lack of alchemical terminology in most of the poems. As a final set of preliminary insights, Complete Perfection Taoism utilized a distinctive contemplative psychology, a psychological view derived from and applicable to contemplative practice. Here, a brief word is in order about contemplative psychology, which is a subdiscipline of Western psychology associated with the Dutch psychologist Han de Wit, who's associated with Shambhala International, and specifically expressed in his book, Contemplative Psychology, in 1991. As stated by de Wit, quote, "In using the term contemplative psychology, we are referring to the psychological insights, knowledge, and methods that we find within contemplative traditions themselves," end quote. Moreover, the term contemplative psychology refers rather to the psychological insights and beliefs that are often implicitly present in the vision of religions and that become concretized in the authentic religious practices of individuals. And this brings us to the main purpose of this introductory study in contemplative psychology, to make explicit and clarify the nature and position of the psychological know-how that contemplative traditions contain. The clarification of the psychological aspects of contemplative traditions may also contribute to a general understanding of the value of contemplative traditions and their psychological perspectives, both from a practical and from a scientific, psychological, or methodological point of view. For de Wit, contemplative practice utilizes and activates a special set of psychological states or conditions. It involves a specific type of knowing, which he refers to as contemplative epistemology, that includes first-person experience. However, this is not uncritical adherent discourse, that is, the discourse of apologetics and dogmatics. Rather, it is a more systematic investigation of one's life through experiences within contemplative practice. The goal, ideally, is to become more conscious, integrated, and, from one perspective, realized. De Wit identifies this as a path to that which religious traditions identify as enlightenment, liberation, fulfillment, emancipation, or salvation. That is, it is soteriological, about the ultimate purpose of human existence. For de Wit, an existential and psychological shift occurs through contemplative practice. Such shifts are documented in the psychological views of religious traditions. Contemplative psychology, in turn, attempts to map higher, quote-unquote, levels of human functioning, which suggests some parallel concerns with humanistic and transpersonal psychology. Complete Perfection Taoism employs the analogy of the horse and monkey to discuss contemplative psychology and the associated anthropology, or discourse on human being. Throughout the poetry and writings of the first-generation adherents, one finds references to horse thought, quote-unquote, ma-yi, or i-ma, and the monkey mind, yuan-xin, or xin-yuan. Here, habituated thought is viewed as analogous to a horse galloping out of control, while the ordinary mind is viewed as analogous to a monkey jumping to and fro. From this Daoist anthropological perspective, which is rooted in earlier Chinese and Daoist psychology, the heart-mind, Xin, often referred to as the ruler, quote-unquote, is the center of human personhood. Here, Xin refers to both the actual physical heart and mind in a more abstract sense, thus my translation of heart-mind. It is associated with innate nature, Xing, spirit, Shen, and the seat of consciousness. From a Taoist perspective, the original condition of the heart-mind and its associated faculties is characterized by clarity and stillness, Qing Jing. Meditation is the associated spiritual discipline. For present purposes, as the development of earlier and foundational complete perfection views, the horse is connected to thought and innate nature. In its conditioned or habituated state, it is characterized by agitation, while in its original or realized state, it is characterized by stillness. The informing soteriology is mystical union with the Tao, specifically through the realization that one's own innate nature, stillness, is the Tao, stillness, so lowercase s and uppercase s. Interestingly, from my perspective, clarity and stillness, or Qing Jing, is one of the primary connective strands throughout the Taoist tradition. It is a classical and foundational Taoist principle, value, and concern. It appears throughout classical Taoist texts associated with the early inner cultivation lineages. For example, in chapter 45 of the Lao Tzu, the Book of Venerable Masters, also known as the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, informs us, quote, "Clarity and stillness are the rectification of the world," end quote. Clarity and stillness in turn became one of the 9 practices, the Jiuxing, of the early Tian Shi, Celestial Masters movement, and the basis for what I refer to as clarity and stillness literature, which was composed during the Tang Dynasty. These principles eventually became a core dimension of early and even modern complete perfection religiosity. Here, a distinction is made between turbidity, Zhuo, and agitation, Dong, and clarity, Qing, and stillness, Jing. Through contemplative practice, one develops inner silence, energetic and psychological stability, and spiritual clarity. The corresponding contemplative experience is often mapped through 5 stages, and I'll return to this later. Major agitation, minor agitation, equal agitation and stillness, minor stillness, and major stillness. For present purposes, in addition to revealing a major connective strand throughout the Taoist tradition, the emphasis on clarity and stillness is noteworthy as a foundational complete perfection concern and commitment. Within the early movement and later monastic order, the Qingjing Jing, the scripture on clarity and stillness, the key text of the clarity and stillness literature, became one of the foundational scriptures. So, according to our medieval complete perfection source, how does one develop clarity and stillness? How does one complete the inner alchemical process with the result of complete psychosomatic transformation? One must tame the wild horse. One must move from a state of habituation, the horse of reckless thought, to a state of realization, the horse of quiet, innate nature. Given time restrictions, I cannot provide a systematic analysis of the 12 poems and 13 illustrations of the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures. Interested individuals will have to await my book in progress, which is tentatively titled Taming the Wild Horse, a study and annotated translation of the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures. This manuscript will probably be completed in early 2016, but I still need to speak to actual horse trainers. Yeah, believe it or not. As an initial inquiry, I would like to read the first poem. With 4 hooves galloping down the path, innate nature cannot return. Among the myriad things, it is difficult to take hold of fallen reins. Set to work right away to make an enclosure that may hold him. Blind in the darkness, the appearance of the horse is nowhere to be found. Such a horse is difficult to catch and enclose. Securely halter his head, and the rest will follow. If his thought is wild, continually tame it with 30 switches. Naturally he will submit, and understanding will be attained. Here, the poem cycle and associated illustrations begin first with the horse having escaped, and then subsequently being caught. One must take hold of fallen reins, quote unquote, that is, regain psychological composure. Then one must tame the horse thought with 30 switches, quote unquote. One must begin to engage in dedicated and prolonged contemplative practice. Spiritual discipline is required for self-transformation. Recalling a contemporaneous internal alchemy map, one must advance the fire, Jinhuo. In such contexts, the so-called firing times, Huoho, often refer to the amount of effort and intention exerted in training. But what specifically is involved in complete perfection meditation? As mentioned, Gao's horse taming pictures seem to presuppose familiarity with complete perfection training regimens, as well as spiritual direction under a monastic elder. For relevant technical specifics, we must turn to other earlier and contemporaneous works. Sitting in meditation, Dao Zuo, does not simply mean to sit with the body erect and the eyes closed. This is superficial sitting. To sit authentically, you must maintain the heart-mind like Mount Tai, remaining unmovable and unshakable throughout the entire day. Maintain this practice, whether standing, walking, sitting, or lying down, whether in movement or stillness. Restrain and seal the four gates, namely the eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. Do not allow the external world to enter in. If there is even the slightest trace of a thought about movement and stillness, this cannot be called quiet sitting, Jingzuo. If you can practice like this, although your body resides in the world of dust, your name will already be listed in the ranks of the immortals. According to the Li Jiao Shiwu Lun, the 15 discourses to establish the teachings, which is attributed to the founder Wang Zhe, complete perfection practitioners are instructed to embrace meditation as an all-pervading existential approach. However, such insights are clearly rooted in intensive contemplative practice. For the foundational practice of quiet sitting, one is instructed to disengage sensory perception and to decrease emotional and intellectual activity to the point that one actually enters the state of meditative absorption characterized by stillness. Interestingly, discourses 7, 8, 9, and 13, or sections 3b through 5b of the text, appear in the 14th century Quanzhen Yaoyu Zuanji, the collection of essential teachings from various immortals, as a guide to Taoist meditation. So there was actually a section of this text made into another text to direct meditation. In a more contemporaneous monastic manual, namely the Quanzhen Qinggui, the Pure Regulations of Complete Perfection, we find parallel instructions on foundational meditative discipline. Complete perfection adepts become accomplished throughout various activities. They concentrate body and heart-mind by aligning the body and practicing quiet sitting. They do not give rise to impure thoughts. Keeping the spinal column erect with the legs crossed in front of the body, the right foot is placed underneath and the hands are joined in tranquil silence. The heart-mind remains unconcerned with the external and the eyes remain closed. Sit for 1 to 2 watches. So a watch is a 2-hour period. That is, apophatic meditation or contemplative practice that is contentless, non-conceptual, and non-dualistic is the means through which one may tame the wild horse, quote unquote. Gao's horse taming pictures in turn map the associated contemplative experience and transformative effects of such training. Although such contemplative cartographies or outlines of stages on the contemplative path are often associated with Buddhism, Daoists also gave attention to various moments or experiences related to contemplative practice. Here, I would simply like to introduce a few that may be seen as Daoist precedents for the horse taming pictures. First, our own Professor Harold Roth has published important studies of classical Daoist apophatic meditation with detailed attention to the related states, the temporary psychological conditions, and traits, the enduring character shifts. Such stages include both preparatory or preliminary and consecutive or sequential ones. So you can see kind of how he's mapped this out. As well as related benefits and transformative effects. In this respect, it is noteworthy that one finds a classical Taoist map that becomes foundational in the later Taoist tradition, namely postural alignment, zheng, stillness, jing, and concentration, ding. So these terms are all found in the classical texts. Employing Daniel Brown's 6-stage map, which was largely developed by analyzing ancient Hindu and Buddhist textual sources, Roth has also placed these materials in comparative perspective. The textual corpus of classical Taoism adds support for this cross-cultural mapping, or at least the latter may be applied to the classical Taoist apophatic meditation. Such attentiveness to stages on the contemplative path continued in medieval Taoism. For example, in the Zhuang Lun, the Discourse on Sitting in Forgetfulness by Sima Chengzhen, the 12th patriarch of Shangqing highest clarity Taoism, he identifies 7 steps to the Tao, quote unquote. These include reverence and trust, interrupting karma, gathering the heart-mind, detachment from affairs, perfect observation, intense concentration, and realizing the Tao. As mentioned, we also find a contemplative cartography utilizing an agitation, turbidity, and clarity and stillness spectrum. This is a movement from habituation to realization, with the latter characterized by increasing depths of stillness and degrees of clarity. That is, emotional and intellectual activity decreases to the point that one disappears in meditative absorption or attunement with the Tao. These examples reveal an earlier Taoist commitment to contemplative practice, including various attempts to map stages on the contemplative path. Such cartographies established historical precedents for the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures, which also parallel contemporaneous internal alchemy systems. Under my reading, the 12 contemplative states and stages documented in the associated poems and illustrations are connected to this. As mentioned, they have been influenced or at least inspired on some level by the 10 Oxherding Pictures of Puming, although Gao's poems and illustrations are untitled. So this is my attempt to approximate what I think is going on in the poems. The 12 stages are as follows: untrained, training begins; restrained, training continues; trained, unhindered, at leisure 1, at leisure 2, resting together, united in forgetfulness, abiding in suchness, and the Dharma body of clarity and purity. As we have seen, the 10 poems or illustrations are equine-centered, while the last 2 poems and last 3 illustrations are not. Interestingly, in contrast to the roughly contemporaneous Chan Buddhist Oxherding Pictures, Gao's Horse Taming Pictures contain a horse throughout. So I don't know if you remember that from the previous illustrations, but the ox wasn't there. The horse thought is active throughout the illustrations, 1 through 8, while the 9th and 10th show the horse thought lying down and sleeping. In terms of stages of contemplative practice and associated experience, the Daoist adept gradually empties and stills the heart-mind and intellectual activity in particular during stages 1 through 4. At this point, in stage 5, one has completely settled ordinary cognitive patterns and habituated psychological states. In stages 6 through 8, one finds that formal discipline and effortful practice are no longer required. In the language of internal alchemy, in which the firing process refers to degrees of effort, as I mentioned earlier, one decreases the fire. Thought has become settled and harmonized, and Taoist adepts may simply practice and rest in leisure. In stages 9 and 10, the Taoist practitioner disappears in meditative absorption, wherein there's complete cessation of thought. Both the attendant and the horse are asleep. Both individual personhood and cognitive activity have ceased. In contemporaneous complete perfection materials, such higher level attainments are also often referred to as fruits of the Tao, Daoguo, and include the conditions of non-dissipation, Wu Lo, being carefree, Xiaoyao, and independence, Zizai. In stages 11 and 12, presented in poems 11 and 12 and illustrations 11 through 13, we move from a more quietistic viewpoint to a more alchemical one. Here, the poems and illustrations no longer focus on the horse. Rather, there are images related to Taoist internal alchemy, Neidan. So this is my interpretation. This is open to interpretation. My interpretation is 11 is representing clerical identity, 12 the immortal embryo or child, and 13 the elderly immortal. Specifically, the 12th poem tells us that one has completed the alchemical process, total psychosomatic transformation, by creating the Dharma body of clarity and purity. Adapted from the Buddhist concept of the 3 bodies, this subtle body within the physical body corresponds to the yang spirit, yang shen, and the body beyond the body, shen wai shen, mentioned in other contemporaneous complete perfection works. The practitioner has become an immortal, is guaranteed of post-mortem existence, and may now enter the Taoist sacred realms and live in mystical union with the Tao. By way of conclusion, we may reflect on contemplative experience more broadly. Gao Daokuan's Horse Taming Pictures suggest that deep contemplative experience is rooted in dedicated and prolonged contemplative practice. The latter is a spiritual discipline that results in discernible and reproducible transformative effects. Such practice and experience are informed by and expressions of distinctive contemplative psychologies. These are psychological views utilized within contemplative systems. They suggest that it is possible to move from habituated being to realized being. They also document various states, traits, and conditions and effects. That is, temporary benefits as well as enduring character shifts. There is often a sequential training regimen with corresponding experiential confirmations and verifications. Along the way, we encounter radical existential, soteriological, and theological claims and insights. We might in turn think of these as psychologies of realization, that is, as cognitive and spiritual maps of human potential and transformation. An important consideration, one so far unrecognized and unaddressed dimension of the Oxherding Pictures, Horse Taming Pictures, and cognate diagrams is the question of the animal, a topic that would take us into complex interpretive territory related to the emerging field of animal studies. Here, I simply want to shift our awareness from looking past the animal to seeing through the animal. Given time constraints and the current venue, this is not the place to provide a systematic exploration of the place and meaning of horses in traditional Chinese culture in general and the Daoist tradition in particular. Suffice it to say, the horse has polyvalent, context-specific meanings, including barbarian threat, male virility, military prowess, and imperial standing. This, of course, does not include the Daoist conceptions most relevant for the present paper. In any case, deeper reflection on these examples reveals both the symbolic use of animals and representations of particular animals. We may consider the apparently innate qualities and characteristics of various animals, as well as culture-specific and tradition-specific associations. For example, the ox and the horse have radically different positions and associations in traditional Chinese culture, and it is important to consider the Buddhist and Daoist motivations respectively. We might in turn contemplate the way in which such representations are rooted in particular human-animal interactions, like my muddy encounter with a horse and a dog encountering each other on Vashon Island, Washington. We might also recognize that there is more to these materials than just depictions of contemplative practice and contemplative experience. They are embedded in and expressions of complex semiotic systems, including animals as beings and symbols. They may also have direct consequences for actual human-animal relationships and living animals. Specifically, under a radical reading of the Chan Buddhist Oxherding Pictures and the Daoist Horse Taming Pictures, spiritual realization may be understood along a transpersonal and transhuman line. As we have seen, the former includes the empty circle or full moon, while the latter concludes with the emergence of the immortal. Both emphasize that the human and the animal, and perhaps the human-animal binary, are forgotten. This state corresponds to enlightenment and immortality in the associated traditions, or perhaps to a trans-tradition form of spiritual realization. While such a condition is often interpreted in anthropocentric terms, that is, the human enters a higher state of consciousness, quote unquote, specifically mystical union, I want to suggest a different direction. If the practitioner has actually transcended dualistic modes, then he or she not only disappears into emptiness, but also into all individual beings, including oxen and horses. Such an interpretation is in fact consistent with informing Chan Buddhist and Daoist views, specifically the former's emphasis on Buddha nature, quote unquote, of all sentient beings, and the latter's recognition of each being's innate nature, quote unquote, as a manifestation of the Tao. It is possible that spiritual realization as a transpersonal state leads to absolute identification with other, a merging of supposedly distinct minds. Everything is, after all, an expression of the Tao, which means that the Tao is the collective being of each individual. Perhaps then, through contemplative practice, one becomes a horse and lives as a horse among horses. Perhaps then one understands that horses, like all beings, aspire to be free in wild places, in the open space of unfenced existence. Thank you for your kind attention. Sorry for the slight technical glitch at the beginning. Do I need to go back to those slides? Or it's okay. All right, we'll forget about it. We'll be Daoists. Sit and forget.
Are there any, have you ever encountered people who read the horse taming or ox taming pictures as the horse or the ox taming the human being?
No, I haven't seen that interpretation. Yeah. Yeah, but that's part of what I'm interested in especially, I mean, obviously work on the horse taming pictures rather than the ox herding pictures. But one of the things that interests me is if it really is a contemplative text, right? And so you use it that way. So you're not just like looking at it as material culture or a kind of symbolic expression, but you're thinking you're actually supposed to engage the text being informed by contemplative practice. So that's my reading of it. I mean, that's why I gave you all that historical background that some of you might have been like, when is this going to be over? Right, which is a natural response to that kind of heavy historical contextualization. It's to show you, right, that they're actually rooted in complete perfection monastic practice. They're rooted in this deep contemplative practice. So this particular person then, and the book goes into this in more detail. Can I step away from this? The book goes into this in more detail where I'm looking at, if you have all of that training and this particular person is so high up in the monastic hierarchy, and we know this, he actually had a very high position in the complete perfection order, then he's training people in these practices, and he's the one who composed this text. So in my way of reading it, it's like you're supposed to actually be reading it through contemplative practice, which then I would say it keeps unfolding. Right? So this is how it's unfolded for me. This presentation is actually from engaging the text that way, which led me, I mean, I was making a joke about talking to horse trainers, but I'm serious. I want to actually show them the pictures and say, how does this fit into your experience with horse training? Right? So these kinds of questions where the question of right, you have this image, then the image takes you into the actual lived reality of horses. It also takes you into the lived reality of horse training. And then you have all these questions, right, that kind of keep unfolding. So I haven't seen that, but to me, it would be a natural unfolding of that kind of engagement where if you're actually contemplating the horse as some kind of insight, then the horse is looking back at you and starts to ask questions of you. Yeah.
So I want to sort of lead from his question and your answer, and like kind of tie in your anthrocentric.
Mm-hmm. Anthropocentric.
Anthropocentric. So you said it's supposed to be seen like through contemplative practice, and then like supposedly as contemplative practice goes on, there are more insights to be found. But I find it interesting that maybe other than Professor Roth, you're the only one who's extensively practiced within the Daoist tradition. So like, is it difficult trying to explain whatever insights you may find from these pictures that people who haven't practiced in the tradition may not? I know that kind of gets into the lecture on Monday.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I would say what I'm trying to do more is to present them in a kind of translation and then present these ideas and then let people engage them that way. So I think there are many ways that you can engage them. You can engage them on the level of aesthetics, you know. You can engage them on the kind of material culture level. You can engage them on the language level. Obviously historical. You can see that this is a kind of synthesis, right, of many different things. So I wasn't explicit about it in the beginning, but I mean, there's a Chinese studies component, right? So people were like, yeah, this is great. Like, we want really hardcore sinology. So they got that, right? And then there are people who are like, contemplative studies. It's like, oh, that's great. He started describing like contemplative practice and contemplative experience, but it should have been more of that, right? And then it's like, and then there's a religious studies component, and now there's an animal studies component, and that I think would probably be, I would assume for most people here, maybe the most radical part is to suggest that somehow contemplative practice is directly related to some kind of animal-human relationship. right? And so what I'm saying is I actually think they're being presented as a contemplative exercise without a particular goal in mind. It's like, what did you see, right? And so maybe you saw, oh, if you read it that way, it's actually the horse that's training the human being, or, right, that you can kind of play with these ideas and see how it unfolds. Yeah. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think I was kind of more interested in so you, in sort of tying what he said about the horse taming the person with like the idea, as almost all of us in this room were raised in this like Abrahamic tradition where like God created man, right? And everything, he created everything else first and then God created man. But like, in fact, I don't know if Taoism has any information on like the sort of, other than the idea of the Tao of like a creation legacy.
No, I mean, cosmogony is kind of complicated in terms of Taoism, but in general, no, that's not there. So I think it's complicated. I mean, what I'd ultimately say is I'm not advocating a particular reading. I'm kind of presenting a reading that I think is viable, but I also think that it was coming out of contemplative practice and it was being given to people doing contemplative practice. So if there's some kind of root in meditation, how do you engage these images, right? And I think that would depend on people's practice and people's experience. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a Quanzhen view being expressed in them. I think it's being informed by Quanzhen, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to engage it, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
Wondering if have you decided how many horse trainers you're going to interview?
Well, it's funny, I
from
emailed
what
a lot.
cultures, because
Yeah.
different places may
Yeah.
have a whole
Yeah.
different story. I'm wondering how that would unfold.
Yeah, so this is like the part that's still ongoing. One is the question of what was going in the late medieval period in China when this was composed. So based on what I know of Gao Daokuan, he was living in places where there were massive amounts of horses, especially if you know anything about what was going on in Chinese culture at the time, which is like the Mongols were starting to invade. And so they were basically conquering the Jurchens, who also had a really strong horse culture. So a lot of that piece, but again, you can just see, this is supposed to be a small book. I don't know how much you know my work, but I tend to write these really ridiculously long books. So the whole point of this project was to write like a really small kind of accessible book. And so I've talked to a number of people and they're like, well, then you just have to write a really long book on the history of horses in China. It's like, no, I'm not doing that book, right? Some other sinologists can do that. But so I think one question is the place of horses in the historical context. The other question is, what kind of did Gao have any interaction with horses, or was he just like, this is great, they have the oxen, Buddhists are like oxen, you know, they're beasts of burden, like let them take, right? This is my reading actually, from a historical contextualist perspective, that the Buddhists were using the ox for a very particular reason. They were thinking of themselves as like oxen in traditional Chinese culture. And Daoists were like, yeah, you can be the oxen. We're the horses, right? We're like the embodiment of Chinese culture. And so there's a way to kind of read them contextually that way. And then the next piece is, how do you engage a kind of contemporary set of concerns, right, with actual horse trainers? So I don't know how far it's going to go.
If you talk to Native Americans or whatever, and
Yeah.
they might say that doesn't make sense to them.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I've emailed a number of sinologists who I know have worked on horse stuff, and they've been like, we don't know what you're talking about. So it's really interesting, right, when you start to get into it of, well, what kind of techniques were used? Are there actually horse training manuals, right, from the late medieval period? All of those kinds of questions. Yeah, so it's difficult. But I don't have a set, I guess, research trajectory on that. I just would like to talk to some. I've talked to a couple people who I know have a lot of, I've had a little bit of experience with horses, but I've talked to a couple people who know a fair amount about horses, and they're like, oh, this is the sequence that you go through in training horses. So it looks like this is a very early stage in training horses. But I think there's a reason why the Daoists are doing that. They're not interested in saddling them. They're not interested in riding them. That's what human beings do, right? So even though they're using that kind of bridal, aspect, that's where it's like you have to kind of control thought, or you have to control your psychological states. But after you do that, you just go, yeah, you're free. You know, you've returned to your innate nature. Like, go run around or hang out with me or do whatever you want to do. So that's part of my reading. Is they're not interested in the next step of horse training, which most people will say first you put the saddle, a light saddle on the horse. This is, I mean, again, preliminary, but you put a light saddle on the horse, then the horse gets comfortable with that. Then you put a heavier saddle on the horse, then the horse gets comfortable with that. Then you actually start to mount the horse and ride the horse. And I think it's pretty clear that that's not what these Daoists are interested in, even though they're not actually talking about horses. That's my point, but they are, right? So it's an interesting kind of question, is like, is that symbolic relationship with the horse going to become an actual relationship with horses, or is there an actual relationship with horses? And that's why I showed you the Zhuangzi passage, because I think it's really like important and foundational, where they're like, if you put a bridle on a horse, right, it's like you've lost your connection to the Tao. Like, you wouldn't do that as a Taoist. You'd be like, run free, right?
Actually, I want to go back to the very beginning,
Mm-hmm.
asking myself why seek out the horse or an oxen in the first place. So what I guess I'm asking is the value of nature
Mm-hmm.
in this contemplative practice.
Mhm.
Do we engage it from this point of view as an aid, as a necessary partner?
Mm-hmm.
Is another read that I'm kind of interested in following, and how does Taoism talk about engaging nature in
Mhm.
contemplative practice?
Yeah, that's what I was saying at the beginning. I think this is fairly complicated. So, I mean, one way is clearly that the kind of foundational Taoist idea is to locate yourself in the, and that's the kind of non-anthropocentric piece, to locate yourself in this larger cosmological kind of unfolding, which animals are part of, right? And I mean, you can say, well, why are we talking about humans and animals as separate things? But that's the convention. So I think what they're imagining is human beings finding their place in all of that, and then learning that. So that's why I started with that. I mean, Zhuangzi is really interesting in this way. There's just no doubt. The Zhuangzi is like, animals know more about the Tao experientially than human beings do, which is radical. They're not speaking of like received religious traditions. There aren't many religious traditions that are like, you should actually make the egret your teacher. This is one of my favorite characters, Guan. I don't know. It's has Guan, egret on one side, and Jian, to see, on the other side. So a lot of people don't like me doing this kind of etymological reading, but in my way of reading this, this is actually saying, if you observe an egret and what it is, you know what observation is. That's what the character's about. So I think they're saying careful attention to not just nature as an abstract, but the specific expressions of, in this case, they would say the Tao, in each thing. All of those things are teaching you harmonization with nature. And then I think that's where these things come in, because they're saying, well, you've altered the nature of the horse by domesticating it. So you can't actually study that kind of horse, because that horse has been corrupted by human beings with their own desires. So that's where it gets really complicated, and I'm sure you've already thought about this, the kind of nature-culture question. You know, what's nature, what's culture, and those kinds of things. But yeah, that's one of my readings of this, is I think on a deeper level, it's you are going into thinking about a horse in a particular way, and then it sends you out in a completely different way. Does that make some sense?
Yes, of course it makes sense, but it raises so many more questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard part about it, because I'm sure you've seen people writing on the Oxherding Pictures. They don't talk about any of this stuff, right? It's like, oh, the ox is like your thought, and it's gotten away, and you must tame it. And then you're like, why do I want to tame animals exactly? No, don't ask that question, right? Am I really an ox? Don't ask that question. Am I a horse? Don't, right? So that's what I'm kind of getting at, is it gets insanely complicated if you actually engage it with all of the layers of it. The layer of what kind of content, because that's the other thing. You know, I haven't seen many people write about the Oxherding Pictures and say, this is the meditation practice that's informing those images. So those images are being used to kind of express contemplative experience or a particular psychological map. But they don't say, this is the method, or these are the methods that you're using to, herd the ox. And that's what I'm trying to do here is say, okay, the first thing is, where is this located? It's located in this monastic system. What kind of practices were they doing? I showed you, these are the kinds of practices they're doing. And it's like, and they're using a horse symbolically to try to represent the stages that you go through in contemplative practice. And you go, wait, but I'm somehow related to a horse. So what does that mean? Am I supposed to actually go out and have relationships with horses? That's why I say the horse training thing is really odd, right? Where I think a lot of people would think, why would you possibly do that? But it's a kind of like unfolding of that. But Jared, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to follow up on this a bit. And I guess what I'd like you to comment a bit more on is clearly you've said these are very apophatic practices that are being documented here. You could even say they have kind of a quietistic ending with the horse and the human
10.
sleep. Yeah, the 10.
Yeah, and then it goes on.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the question I have is the relationship between this more pietistic dimension and then the alchemical tradition that follows that.
Yeah.
So maybe the easiest way to ask it would be, is there any point in the later stages, 11 through 13, where thought is, I guess you could say, allowed again or okay again, or is that kind of quiet, still mind, the clarity and stillness that's the dominant part of stages 1 through 10 expected to be preserved?
No, I think
in
it's
the exact
expected to
same
be
way?
continued. This is actually people who, I don't know how much you know about Neidan Daoist internal alchemy. This is very traditional in Neidan. A lot of times you start with emptiness-based practice, and then that has to really take root, because there's no point in doing energetic practices that can be dangerous, right? Before you have that kind of root in stillness or emptiness. Then you do a whole kind of alchemical practice where you transmute yourself, where you go through kind of complete psychosomatic transformation, and then oftentimes it ends back in emptiness-based practice. Yeah. So I think in this case, what they're really talking about is you do all of that, and then at the end you see the horse and the attendant or the shepherd are laying down next to each other. And then from that, because that means all of your thoughts are completely stilled, then you can do alchemy. You can't do alchemy before that, right? So they're basically saying, if you read it sequentially, and this again is open to interpretation, but if you read it sequentially, after stage 10, poem 10, you go into poem 11, stage 11, and then you go into poem 12 and or images 12 and 13. Yeah. And so
I guess we could say then that, I'm just thinking comparatively between the Buddhist sources and the Daoist sources here, where, it's quite clear that a lot of the language and the structure and the stages in parts 1 through 10 that you're looking at have plenty of antecedents in Indian and Chinese and Tibetan Buddhist materials. But where the Buddhists take that in a more kind of conceptual direction, ultimately with doing insight practice, and even in some cases where then thoughts and perceptions are totally allowed once you're more familiarized with this clarity and stillness, seems like the Taoists, you're saying, take it in a much more psychosomatic direction, where it's about working with the energy, cultivating the inner embryo that will lead to the process of transcendence or immortality.
Yeah,
and that remains thoroughly non-conceptual.
Yeah, because conceptualization is the ox. Conceptualization is the horse. Human beings like to convince themselves that it's not, but from a contemplative perspective, that's still well, I probably shouldn't say that because then it's going to sound a little different. It would be problematic from the point of view of this map, because the point is not emptiness. The point is the emptiness where there's complete energetic presence. That's what emptiness is for. That's what, in the edited volume that's coming out on contemplative literature, this is one of the things I talk about, is the conception of silence, right? And people are just like, silence is silence, really? You should talk to Quakers about silence. You should talk to Buddhists about silence. You should talk to Daoists about silence. They're different conceptions of silence. Is silence a kind of space to be filled by something else? Is silent the ultimate state that you're supposed to be in? So in this case, they're basically saying the nature of reality is energetic. So how do you awaken the subtle body, what I was talking about, the yang shen, the yang spirit, or the shen wai shen, the body beyond the body? How do you actually awaken that and live through that, right? So I think there's actually a lot more connection between what I was talking about as the kind of quietistic mode, the non-conceptual mode, and the alchemical or the energetic. These Taoists are seeing them as going together. So the purpose is not to live your life in a kind of non-conceptual state. It's to be totally energetic attuned to everything that's going on. And that's why I'm making that argument about the horse. Because if you keep following that, where do you stop? What are you not connected to? What are you not understanding? What's not informing your practice? So then maybe it's all taking you out to hang out with horses. I don't know. I'm just saying there are these kinds of questions in here.
I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about the nature of the animal, because obviously Buddhists didn't choose like the taming of the monkey because
exactly.
Monkeys can't be tamed.
Although there is a monkey in the Tibetan elephant, and that's sorry about that. That was the glitch part. But if you kind of look if you look at that, there's actually and I don't know enough, but there was on the panel that we had at AAR. Benjamin Bogan from Skidmore did a talk on this, and he was talking about what the monkey represents and what the elephant represents, and I don't remember the specific symbolic associations.
Agitation and dullness.
What is it?
Agitation and dullness.
Agitation and dullness.
So the hair is dull and the monkey.
Okay, yeah, because there's a hare, there's a rabbit in there too. But they're talking about monkeys too, the Daoists. Yeah. But I think the question is, why are they, and so it might be that it's random. That's entirely possible. Someone can make that argument. But I don't think so. I think there actually is some major significance with the identification, with Chan Buddhists identifying with oxen and Daoists identifying with horses, right? Because so under my reading, it couldn't have been the opposite. Daoists would not have been, we're like oxen. It's like, right, Buddhists are like oxen. Like, let them till the fields, let them be harnessed up, use them how you want. And Buddhists were kind of like, maybe that's, I don't know, I'm just saying. But I think the horse makes a lot of sense in terms of all of the associations of horses in traditional Chinese culture. That Taoists were like, we're the horses of traditional Chinese culture. We might not be recognized that way, but we are, right? So, but anyway, I kind of preface, so what was the actual question?
Yeah, that was basically the question. I guess oxen, they kind of till fields. It's kind of like working karma, maybe working off karma.
Yeah, well, these are the questions. This is, I think, the question I'm raising is, what do they represent? Is there significance that different people chose different animals? So, yeah, I think the big thing is it's not random. I don't think you can go with that. But why, right? And that's why I was saying, I think in the Taoist tradition, what you have to do is go through the materials and see where horses are. And that's what I kind of showed you some of that. There are these horses in the Zhuangzi. Then there's horses in earlier Quanzhen, where they're tame your horse thought. And then you get into these kinds of things. So that you'd have to do the same thing in Chan Buddhism. And a little bit of that has been done. Where was the ox? How was the ox described in earlier Buddhist literature? Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything to this, and maybe that's my question for you, but in the Quran, and so informing Sufism a little bit, is this concept of Ashrafal Mukhaka, I think it roughly translates to humans as the custodians of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
The idea being we're the only creatures that have been given intellect, and thus we have this responsibility. And I'm wondering if there's any parallel that you see in the work with that concept.
No, so I think that's what's interesting about the kind of comparative cross-cultural piece, that Taoists tend to have the opposite view, right? That is, there is no privileging of the human ultimately. So this is why, it's one of, from my reading, some people will probably have a different interpretation of Taoism, but my reading of Taoism is it's one of the least anthropocentric traditions. So if anything, they actually subvert the human, because of course, this is the human tendency. Human beings like to tell them stories about how great they are, and then you're like, what are the consequences for all the other beings while you're telling yourself how great you are? Oh, they're under our care. Well, you're not doing a very good job, right? It's like, well, sorry, we were supposed to. we'll apologize later. And I think Taoists are like, the whole problem is you've told yourself this story, you know? So it's an interesting kind of debate or dialogue, right? If Taoists can say to Muslims, you know, why don't you see Allah in all beings, right? Because I think then you start to get more into Sufism, right? And some Muslims would say, you know, this is slightly problematic to start talking this way. But Sufis, I think, would be less uncomfortable with that. So to say, why don't you start to actually see Allah, the face of Allah, in all beings? You know, you, as far as I know, you don't get that as much in Sufism, as far as I know. But of course, I'm not a scholar on that. But in Sufism, you definitely get really radical statements about you're praying to Allah when you meet me. Right? This is what gets them into trouble, because it's like from a conventional Islamic perspective, you can't say that. And Sufis are like, right, we're talking about actual fana and baqa. You know those terms are. Fana is like disappearance, and baqa is like abiding in Allah. So those states that you get in Sufism start to sound pretty similar to some of the things Taoists are describing. But I think that's one of the things I'm raising is what are the consequences for actual ways of perceiving or relating, you know? And here, I think they really want human beings to find their place amongst everything else. Not to say, well, yeah, we're kind of like everything else, but we're higher, or oh, we were so great because we got intellect. Because in a lot of the sources, they have an explicit critique about that kind of consciousness. It's that kind of consciousness, like the intellect, the discriminating mind, that's created all the problems. So they start to have almost like a negative view, right? Like some other traditions might privilege that capacity and say, well, see how great we are, we can like make all these distinctions, and Taoists are like, that's how you lost the Tao, by like somehow that happening, having that capacity in consciousness. Because clearly the hawk isn't going, I don't know, do I want that rabbit or do I want that rabbit? Right? They're just like, I'll take that rabbit. It's like, well, that's the one that crossed in front of me. So I think Taoists are starting to see a more maybe participatory mode for humans. So you'd haven't asked a question, and I think maybe we have to stop soon, Hal, but you can tell me.
So I understand that in a lot of the drawings and texts, there's an emphasis on flowing cognition and not being attached to a certain personal identity. So I was just wondering, when you're talking about anthropocentrism, is the stage when we reach enlightenment and when we become, I guess, like friends with the horse, is that an idea of we're no longer being attached to our personal identity as someone attempting to tame the horse, but rather we are no longer attached to that goal as we are with just even being friendly with the horse or understanding the horse?
Yeah, I mean, so my reading of this is that fundamentally it's about your relationship to your thought, right? I mean, they're using the horse as an analogy to your thought, right? And so it's like a horse, and you probably know this. I mean, if you don't know this, then that's pretty amazing that your thought runs around, right? And doesn't want to settle down. And you're like, it's time to go in the corral. And it's like, I'm not going in the corral. And it's like, it's midnight. It's like, I'm not going in the corral. And then it's like, you know, and then it keeps going. And then it's like 1 o'clock in the morning. You're like, no, I really need to sleep. Like, I have class tomorrow. And then it's like, so then finally you settle down, and then you wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then it starts back up again. It's like, what's going on with my mind? That's what they're primarily describing. So my question, though, is when you settle that down, the horse thought, by analogy, does that start to open you up to communication with other things? That's what Taoism has said. I mean, the classical Taoists said that, but I mean, these Taoists for sure say that. They for sure are talking about a kind of energetic participation in the Tao. And so, and that's why I was emphasizing what I did in the talk, is I think that there's a tendency to think it's still about me, but it's like, but they're saying it's not about you. They're saying at some point you overcome the limitation of your own kind of personal identity, right? And so, of course, I mean, we're conceptualizing this, but then if you say, well, actually, in terms of contemplative experience, what would that mean? I'm saying, I think it means that you start to actually hang out with horses. I know, it sounds weird, but I think they're basically like, you aren't like, I just want to be around human beings. Why do you just want to be around, right? That's like an ordinary human being's way of doing something. It's like, why don't you just have relationships with whatever are manifesting in the present moment. Why all these distinctions, right? Oh, horses are lower than human beings, so I'm not talking to horses, right? It's like, right, we're not talking about talking to horses. We're talking about, right, that's what's interesting about the images. It's like you start to just like literally hang out with the horse. So of course they're using that to say you're just hanging out with your thoughts and you're not really that concerned about it. But then if it starts to transform where you're seeing things as they are, doesn't that also mean, right, that you're open to whatever being, and you know, I'm sure you've all had this experience. I mean, you hear birds singing, and there are times when you just go, oh, okay, yeah, it's just birds singing. That's, I think, what they're describing, right? But they're telling you, that's what interests me about these images. They're telling you there's a way to get there. Like, if that isn't your daily experience, they're telling you there are practices that transform your consciousness that will lead to this state. Right? And that's what I'm saying is maybe it turns it back onto the world and it opens up some other kind of possibility of experiencing. I don't know. Go ahead.
I really enjoyed your talk. There's so many interesting points that you touched upon. I think one of the interesting contrasts is with the Oxherding Pictures and the horse taming pictures. Well, first of all, I wasn't fully cognizant that there were two different versions of the Oxherding Pictures.
Yeah.
One that ends in a complete unity circle.
Yeah, exactly.
But the other one, it's one I'm much more familiar with, is that's the seventh stage.
Because that's the one because the one that you're more familiar with is the one that's most influential in Japan.
That's probably how I got
Yeah,
it.
and I'm just saying, because I mean, I'm obviously, this isn't my area of specialization, but in the process of researching this, I was trying to figure out, well, why the Puming edition in China? And it's like, because it became the dominant set in China. So it's interesting to also think, and you would probably know more about this than me, but you know, how did that alter like Chan Buddhist way of thinking about Chan practice? And in Japan, did it become more engaged? Because that's what the Koan pictures are. It's about you have to actually have social engagement, or you have to return to the world and have applied practice. And so, anyway, so I'm giving you a little bit of that detail.
That's so in the Oxherding Pictures, the symbolism of the ox symbolizes your innate nature,
right?
The kind of grounded being, and I kind of wonder if that also might be. And I think it works for both the Puming and the Guan versions. I wonder if that might also be involved in the horse taming pictures, that the horse kind of represents, from a Taoist perspective, your innate nature. I mean, what you said earlier in the talk is something that I really appreciated. That also links up very much with the original, the early tradition, is the linking of your innate nature with the Tao.
Right.
That ultimately, at the deepest state, your innate nature is kind of grounded in and based in and founded in the Tao.
Yeah.
So there's a real parallel with the innate nature in the Chan and Zen traditions of the kind of one mind or Buddha mind or unborn Buddha mind being that kind of playing the same role. So then the issue is there a deliberate, so after you experience the unity and you come, so the Japanese, more popular Japanese versions, you come back and integrate into everyday life. Now, the Puming, the Chinese, and then the horse taming pictures, there's not as much of an emphasis on coming, at least it's not an obvious emphasis on coming back into the world. And then if there isn't that kind of obvious emphasis, you were implying that, in fact, when you get there, then that's the basis for beginning a deep kind of what's called psychosomatic energy training. But that's completely, it's basically off the charts. It's not included there.
Yeah, so my I mean, this is still getting worked out, but at this point, and it's pretty far along, but it's not complete, my reading is that it's both simultaneously. So the horse represents thought, which is one particular expression of innate nature, but it's a disruptive pattern. And then there's the kind of stilled horse, which is innate nature, right? And this is what interests me much, in a certain way, like more philosophically, and also I think in terms of social engagement, is what they're really arguing that domestication leads to all this kind of chaos, because the horse or thought, you're trying to hold it, right? And this is very Taoist. You're trying to hold it, you're trying to hold it. So the horse is like, I'm getting out of here. And you're like, don't leave, right? And so finally the horse breaks away, and then you kind of bring it back. And so you have to kind of like guide it to kind of settle down. But then when it settles down, it returns to its own innate nature, which is wildness. So it actually resolves that apparent contradiction between cultivation and wildness. That's my initial reading of it. The whole thing gets complicated when you really start thinking about horses and Chinese politics, because what horses will represent historically is a lot of different things, including if you think about, I don't know how much you know about Chinese history, but like if you think about the Jurchens or the Mongols with their horses, this is not looking good for the Han, right? It's like the Song dynasty, it's like this is not looking good for you, right? Because you don't have the actual best horses, and you're not the most skilled at horse warfare. So you start to think, well, isn't that like a certain kind of use of horses? So I'm saying those layers start to become fairly complicated, where is that wildness, is that domestication, because again, the barbarian stuff is like, oh, those are the wild people. It's like, are they really wild, or how do they fit into that paradigm? So the thing that interests me about this is the possibility, in this sense, the possibility of cultivation returns you to some kind of connection with wildness, and wildness is positive. So there's a way to kind of reconcile those two experiences of being human, right? Where you have these tendencies to be out of control, and it's like, that's not wildness. It's like, well, that's what everybody told me wildness is. It's like, no, that was the domesticated horse running away, right? So the wildness is actually the horse just being itself and not having...
Cultivating your innate spontaneity.
Yeah, exactly.
Seems like
Which it was great for a horse, because I actually was going to try to put a snippet of video of a horse running, and I thought, if I thought there was going to be a technological glitch with this, you can just imagine if I was showing you like a video clip. So should we? Okay, thanks so much.